So over the last 2 weeks I've been releasing daily shorts, which are mini book reviews about the books that inspired the Project Moon games, which I made a video on some time ago. And I was asked by some people to compile them all into one video. It's not a very long video, but I thought I'd use this short time before I compile them all to address some things. For one, I am now aware that it's not Don Quixote or Don Quixote or Don Quixote, it's Don Quixote. I think it's Don Quixote. I'm not Spanish, I'm German with Italian heritage. Just bear with me on this, okay? I'm sorry.
Don Quixote.
And the other is that apparently for some of these books, for instance, Camus' The Stranger, I was a bit uninformed going in, reading them, and then critiquing them afterwards, since I'm not a philosopher, so I wasn't really aware of the ins and outs of absurdism when I was talking about that book, for instance. Other than that, enjoy the short compilation. Orlando Furioso is a weird story, as despite being technically based on a guy who actually existed, the story turns into a globe-trotting sci-fi epic that ends up going to the moon. It's an extremely interesting read if nothing else, as it's easily one of the most out there stories of the epoch, combining several genres and going against a lot of notions of how a story should be structured at the time. I definitely recommend giving it a shot sometime, but don't be weirded out if it goes off the rails. The Korean story The Wings, written by author Yi Sang, is often considered one of the most important pieces of Korean literature. Truth be told, I don't like this novel very much. It's basically one big piece of self-deprecation from the main character, who has severe anxiety and is basically just a piece representing the struggles of the intellectuals of the era. It's primarily worth reading if you're a Korean history nerd, or if you think of yourself smarter than anyone else. I don't think you'd be missing out on much otherwise. Goethe's Faust is generally regarded as one of the most important plays of all time. Having a bunch of old school friends who were forced to read it back in high school, they always told me of how dreadful they found it, but honestly I quite like it. The idea of a man making a deal with the devil and coming to regret it pretty much spawned from this play, and I genuinely do believe that its status as one of the best pieces of German literature is most definitely warranted. Having read it in German, I can safely say that Goethe's writing style is extremely poignant, and each thought Faust expresses perfectly displays the sheer unsatisfaction he has in life, both as a scholar and as a human. I'd highly recommend reading it. Don Quixote, or as annoying people will tell you it's called, Don Quixote, is a story I feel like everyone and their mom at the very least knows of, and honestly, I get it. It's a fun story with a good message. It's a simple tale of a guy who thinks way too highly of himself, and antics ensue. I think the original can be a bit of a chore to read due to its episodic nature, but I'd still say it's worth going through at least once. Hellscreen is a short story about a painter who can only paint what he has seen, and is asked to paint hell. Antics ensue. This is actually one of my favorite short stories, and I put it up there with I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. On its surface it's about a painter who becomes more and more deranged, but it turns out to be a surprisingly intricate critique of how we as people choose to interpret events around us. Absolutely worth reading. Out of all of these books, The Stranger is easily the one I dislike the most. While the first half brings up a lot of really interesting questions, the second half then proceeds to be little more than absurdist ramblings coming to the ultimate conclusion that life is meaningless and that's awesome somehow. Which is kind of funny when you consider that Camus apparently really hated nihilists. Dream of the Red Chamber, or Hong Lu Meng, is a pretty lengthy and extremely dense book. Since it follows two branches of a family of Chinese aristocrats, it gets a shit ton of characters in it, and generally, at least 40 of those are considered major. It's an all-around extremely interesting dissection of the rise and fall of said family, as well as their lifestyle and their inability to connect to regular people. I would highly recommend this to anybody interested in Chinese history, but by virtue of being absolutely stacked, it can be kind of hard to follow sometimes. Wuthering Heights is an extremely intricate story and one I would definitely recommend to anybody with an interest in English literature. The animosity between the different cast members is built up extremely well, and it's one of the only stories I can think of with a well-executed multi-generational plot, especially one where just about everyone is absolutely miserable. There have been a bunch of adaptations of the story, but all of them have not been received too well. And as far as I can tell, they only ever adapt the first half other than like a small handful of them. I'm gonna say this up front, I did not care for Moby Dick. It's basically the quintessential revenge bad story, and while Ahab's self-destructive descent into madness dragging everyone around him down is executed really well, the surrounding cast isn't that interesting and the narrative seriously feels like it drags a lot of the time. Still worth reading because of how influential it was though. Crime and Punishment is, contrary to what the name suggests, 10% about the actual crime and 5% about the punishment. Most of the novel is about Raskolnikov coming to terms with his actions and trying to process his guilt. And while the book does a good job of portraying his inner turmoil, and is great at representing what happens when you push nihilism to its most logical extremes, it also leaves its side characters feeling dependent on Rodion's actions, as if the whole world revolved around him, which I'd argue is easily the story's greatest flaw. Still a good read though. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy is quite possibly the first self-insert fanfiction ever written, and despite almost everyone always focusing on just the first part, Inferno, I find the entire thing to be extremely fascinating. Dante's many ideas regarding the afterlife are pretty unique, and especially his views in Paradiso are really interesting. I recommend at the very least reading Inferno due to pop culture's fascination with it, but Purgatorio and Paradiso and their combination of religion and science are definitely also worth your time. Demian is a work that absolutely needs to be read under the consideration of its historical context, as a piece published in Germany not long after World War I. Its ideas pertaining to the worlds of good and evil were meant to resonate with the soldiers of the war who had returned home, and consequently the dissection between those two worlds, which the entire story centers around, and their representative ideas, is expertly done. If you can, I highly recommend reading this book in the German original due to Hermann Hesse's extremely poignant writing style. The Odyssey is one of the historically most important stories of all time, and for good reason. The way it manages to blend reality and fiction to create a simultaneously absurd yet believable story is really impressive. While I don't think that reading the entire thing is necessary to understand its contents, it is to this day an extremely enjoyable read, albeit one that can drag its feet hard. The Metamorphosis is one of the most important pieces of German literature, and also one of my favorite books. The writing is excellent, and it is easily one of Kafka's greatest works. Something that in my experience the English translations of the story never seem to get quite right is the many quirks in the characters, in particularly Gregor Samsa, and how they speak. This is absolutely worth reading, and I highly suggest it to anybody.